Hi, I'm Jack from GatelyAcademy. In this lesson, we're going to talk about disclosures. There are three basic disclosures that you should be aware of for the Massachusetts portion of the real estate exam. The first one would be the disclosure of agency. Second, conflict of interest. And third, rental fee disclosures. When it comes to agency, we have 6 types of agency which are allowed in Massachusetts, the 6 types of agency. There is another video that we have that goes over all 6 of those. If you have not seen that video, strongly recommending that you watch the video about the types of agency that are allowed in Massachusetts. We also have another video about the fiduciary responsibilities that are going to be required in Massachusetts. You should watch those videos combined with this one to get the full breadth of the agency lesson. But in this lesson, we're just going to focus on agency relationships and how you disclose it. So let's cut to the most common paperwork that you're going to use, most likely as a real estate agent. Okay, and here we are. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts Board of Registration of Real Estate Brokers and Salespersons, the Massachusetts Mandatory Real Estate Licensee Consumer Relationship Disclosure. What a very long title. My recommendation to you would be just to call it the relationship disclosure. The relationship disclosure. You can get into a little bit of trouble if you just call things the disclosure, because there are so many different disclosures that somebody might lose the context of your discussion. So it's much better to put a tag on it: relationship disclosure, property condition disclosure, rental fee, whatever it happens to be. Just don't use the word disclosure, because you could possibly lose your audience. They might not know exactly what disclosure you're talking about. So if you're selling property in Massachusetts, either representing a buyer or a seller, this will probably be, on a regular basis, the most common piece of paperwork that you use as an agent. Let's go over it for you. Right at the top of the page, it says this is not a contract. This is not a contract. Now, why does it say that at the top of the page? Well, further down the page, you're going to ask your client to sign it. And one of the most common concerns from the client, questions from a client is, hey, is this a contract? Mom and Dad told me never to sign any contracts. And so right off the bat, the Board of Registration wanted to make it clear that this is not, in fact, a contract. It is just simply a disclosure provided to you, the consumer, by the real estate licensee listed below in the disclosure. So effectively, it's the real estate licensee, which soon will be you if you pass and get your license, telling the consumer something, and then the licensee asking the consumer to sign off, acknowledging that we told them, basically what it works. So when do you have to do this? Well, you must do it, and this sounds like a really good test question, at the first personal meeting with you to discuss a specific property. Well, that does sound like a good test question. Notice that's a 2-part standard. That's a 2-part standard. So if buyer Bob goes into Agent Amy's office and they talk about the fact that buyer Bob is looking for a 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath house, that is not a particular property. That's just buyer Bob's overall wants and needs for a house, 3-bed, 2.5 bath. Agent Amy is not required to disclose agency as part of that chat, as part of that visit. So if buyer Bob left and Agent Amy didn't say or use this form, that would be okay. So be careful on the exam. They want to make sure that you understand that there's a 2-part standard, and it requires a first personal meeting. That means face-to-face. So over the phone or text message or whatever, that doesn't count either. It's got to be in person. The event, it is possible that the relationship could change and you could just do a new disclosure at that time if that happens. That's not likely, but it's possible. Scanning down here, there's a big paragraph here about the fact that you are allowed to get your own seller's agent or your own buyer's agent. You could also get a facilitator. Now, I'm pretty sure that most of you already know what a seller's agent is. They work exclusively for the seller. Same opposite for the buyer. Buyer's agent work exclusively for the buyer. Facilitator, we're going to get into that in one of the videos where we talk about all of the 6 types of relationship. Just understand that a facilitator, according to this form, is there to assist the consumer. This here is the money sentence, the next one. All real estate licensees, regardless of the working relationship with the consumer. That's an important little phrase there. It sounds like a good test question you could make from that. By law, must present properties honestly and accurately and disclose known material defects in the real estate. And disclose known material defects in the real estate. We'll probably make a separate video altogether about disclosure of property defects, known material defects. But if you know something is wrong, just a quick reminder, if you know that something is wrong with the property, like the basement floods, and you're the seller's agent, you must disclose it, even if the seller doesn't want you to. In fact, you must disclose it no matter what your working relationship is with the consumer. The next paragraph here is a big, long paragraph of things that technically you're not responsible for. Now, a big caveat, and we'll get to that in a quick second, but there's a whole list of professional responsibilities here: tax, insurance, zoning, permitting, lead paint, home inspections, insect inspections, septic system, wetland, environmental evaluations. You're not responsible for any of that as a licensee. Although, here's the caveat I just want to make really quickly. You are responsible to be honest and accurate. So if you are going to comment on one of these specialties, you better make sure that you're accurate and honest. Because should you make a false statement, whether you know it or not, you could be held liable for that because you didn't live up to the standard of being honest and accurate. So you might want to preclude yourself or curtail yourself or limit yourself to aspects that you are responsible. And that, of course, would be the real estate transaction. If you're not quite sure about some type of septic system regulation or zoning or permitting, you might want to, beg off. Don't be an expert in everything, and I think you know what I mean. Proceed with caution. All right. Scanning down here a little bit, just a quick reminder: do not assume that the real estate licensee works solely for you unless you have a relationship for that agreement. An agreement for that relationship. I really think that should actually be at the top of the page, but that's where they decided to put that sentence. Very important. For more detailed descriptions, see page 2, and we'll cover page 2 when we talk about the types of agency that are available. I've mentioned that a couple of times in another video. So now you have the choice here of selecting one. This form can be used if you represent a seller, a buyer, or a facilitator. So let's pretend that we represent a seller. So we're the list agent, as it's sometimes called. Underneath there, you'll see that italicized sentence which says, if seller or buyer's agent is checked above, which we did, we checked seller's agent, the real estate licensee must complete the following section. So here's where you're going to want to talk to your broker, because you're going to have to check whether or not you're a non-designated agency or a designated agency. In a nutshell, and we'll try to avoid the fine print that's underneath each of these descriptions, but in a nutshell, a designated agency is an agency which you can co-broke a deal with your co-worker, which means that the other agent works in your own office. Usually, if you represent the seller, the agent representing the buyer works at some other office across town or wherever. But at a designated agency, they allow you to actually co-broke a deal with one of your coworkers. Yeah, so you have to get advance written consent to do that. We'll talk more about that in the 6 types of agency video. But it is a thing in Massachusetts that you're allowed to co-broke a deal with one of your fellow agents in the same office. However, on the left-hand side, if you check non-designated agency, they don't allow you to do that at a non-designated agency. At a non-designated agency, all of the agents working that office work for you. In this case here, we would check seller down here. We would check seller down here. So check with your broker as to how they set up their agency at your office. Scrolling down a little bit further, you'll see that you'll need to sign this and provide your license number. Check whether you're a broker or a salesperson and put the date on there. You also need to have the name of the real estate agency you work for, or as they say here, brokerage, and the brokerage license number. The agency doesn't need to sign, but they do need to be named, and the number needs to be there. The consumer does not need to sign this form, although it's a good idea if you can get them to sign the form, as that's what the state would hope you to achieve. As you can see down here, let me just say this, scroll down just a teeny bit more. There is a checkbox down at the bottom. Check here if consumer declines to sign this notice. Remember, it's not a contract. It is just a disclosure. And if they don't want to sign saying you told them these things, they don't have to. If you ever have a client that doesn't want to sign it, then you should fill it out and check that box and then put this in the folder, in the deal folder. It's going to be highly customary to include this form with any type of offer. So hopefully, if you find these folks a property that they like, you'll be able to revisit this form and have them sign a new one at that time. Sometimes when you meet somebody for the very first time, you haven't built up a rapport and it might be difficult to get them to sign it. You don't want to burn that lead, so to speak. And so if at first they give you some resistance, remember you probably can't have an opportunity to revisit it later. And it is highly customary to send in this form with any offer. Getting the seller to sign this form is usually very, very easy. You're sitting at their kitchen table, most likely, for a residential transaction. They're filling out some other paperwork like the listing agreement, and then this is just one other piece of paperwork. So getting the seller to sign it is usually pretty easy. All right, let's talk about conflict of interest. Conflict of interest number 1. You cannot buy, sell, rent, mortgage, acquire an interest in any property in which your family member, oh, by the way, on the exam, sometimes they call family member kin. It's not a word that I use, but officially on the exam, you might see that, or your business partner. So let me just restate real quickly. You cannot buy, sell, rent, mortgage, or acquire an interest in a property in which your family member, or your business partner has an interest without fully disclosing that interest. That's pretty straightforward rule. Here's how I would do it. I would first put it in the listing. In the multiple listing service, there's a disclosure section, and it's pretty easy to say something in there like seller is agent or something like that. And from time to time, you will see that listed there. Or they'll say seller is relative of agent or something like that. Very, very simple. Later on in the process, you also want to include this language in the purchase and sale agreement. I might actually just copy and paste it over to the purchase and sale agreement and also add the actual names so that we know exactly who is who in the purchase and sale agreement. You see, by putting in this purchase and sale agreement, then everyone's going to sign the purchase and sale agreement, the buyers and the sellers, and that's what you really need. You need consent to this. You need written consent. If you're going to be buying, selling, renting, mortgaging, or acquiring an interest in a property that you or your family or your business partner has, you need to have them consent to that. And the first way to kind of disclose it to start the process is in the listing, but you really need to put it in the purchase and sale. All right, up next. Okay, so I interpret this next one fairly widely. In the regulation, they use the word option, but I interpret this fairly widely. Here's the prohibition. You shall not take an option in a property for which you were first approached to represent the property as the listing agent without first disclosing that you are now interested as a buyer, right? So if you're called over to someone's house, ostensibly to be their agent, to be their list agent, the seller's agent, and then while you're there, you're like, you're thinking to yourself, hey, I want to buy it. Hey, this would be a good house for me. And once that happens, and I think this is a really kind of one of those things that you really have to self-police yourself. Once that happens, you really need to immediately kind of call a halt to the meeting and disclose your now conflict, because now you've gone from this potential person as an agent who your alliances would be perfectly aligned with the interest of the seller. Now you've gone to a buyer, so you've changed roles, and you've got to disclose that immediately before you take an option. And again, I would broadly interpret that as to be any type of buyer type of position in that property. A net listing is an other conflict of interest situation where basically the seller says, hey, make me $100,000 on this deal, and everything above that, you as the agent get to keep. And the agent says, oh, really, 100,000? And sure, I can get you 100,000. Meanwhile, the agent ends up selling it for $175,000, and $75,000 becomes the fee. And this is a no-no, because you, as the agent, you should be telling the seller, hey, your property is not worth 100,000. Your property is closer to be worth $175,000. And so in this case here, you're not serving the interest of the consumer, the general public, your client. You're serving your own interests by keeping the seller in the dark as to what the real value of the property is, because you want to get the overage here. That is a no-no in Massachusetts, a net listing where you are commissioned over a certain dollar figure above a certain dollar figure. That's a no-no. You must work on a percentage basis in Massachusetts. And lastly, conveying offers. So as a list agent, you're hopefully going to receive offers for property that you've listed, right? That's the name of the game. And when you get these offers, they must be conveyed, I'll just add in here, to the seller who's your client, what we call forthwith. That means right away, without delay. If you fall down, don't bother to get up. What they really mean here is you can't cherry pick offers, especially. So let's just say you take an offer in from some agent that you just don't like them, and you don't want to deal with them, or whatever the situation is, and you put that at the bottom of your pile because you know some friend of yours later on in the day is going to give you an offer, and you like your friend, the other agent. So you can't cherry pick the offers. You have to send over to your client the offers as you receive them. And that's just the way it is. Now, most of the times, nowadays, in the modern era, we receive offers by email, and you can just download the PDF offer and then upload it to a new email and send it off to your clients. The days of getting hand-delivered offers are somewhat over, although I'm sure that does occur in some cases. But you're more likely to get an offer by email nowadays. Just send it right over to your seller without delay. If you think some other offer is going to come in, it may or may not. I mean, how many times have I had agents call me and say, hey, Jack, we're putting together an offer on your listing, and then you never hear from them. So, hey, you got to take one step at a time. When you get an offer, send it over to your seller. That's just the rule. And lastly for this video, rental fees. There's always a rental fee. It just depends upon who pays it. So sometimes it's paid by the landlord and sometimes it's paid by the tenant. It can sometimes also be shared between these two parties. The question is here, of course, when the tenant pays any portion of the rental fee. So any portion of the rental fee paid by the tenant, it must be disclosed in advance. There are situations where the tenant might be paying, for instance, a credit fee, a credit report fee or something like that. That should also be, to be fair to the tenant, disclosed in advance. But what we're talking about is the fee that you as an agent and the brokerage earn for finding them the apartment, sometimes known as the finder's fee. In Boston, it's very common that the tenant pays the rental fee. In the suburbs and other parts of the state, it's very common that the landlord pays the rental fee. And it is somewhat seasonal depending upon the time of year and supply and demand and all those types of things. In every situation, when the tenant pays the fee, it must be disclosed.